Everything you think you know about the Netherlands may be wrong. We usually picture tulip fields, windmills, and peaceful canals. But few people realize that more than 18 million Dutch citizens live on land that lies below sea level. In some places, giant cargo ships sail higher than the rooftops of nearby homes. According to the laws of nature, water always flows toward lower ground. By all logic, this land should have disappeared beneath the sea long ago. Yet it remains home to more than 18 million people. Whenever storms in the North Sea push water levels beyond the danger threshold, the entire country immediately enters a state of readiness. Offshore, a gigantic system begins to awaken. Inside the cities, trams keep running, cafes remain open, and children sleep peacefully in their homes. Few people realize that just a few dozen kilometers away, a battle against the sea is being fought every minute to keep that ordinary life possible. If that entire system stopped working for just 1 hour, the sea would begin reclaiming the land the Dutch spent centuries winning from it. What is really keeping a nation below sea level alive after centuries? And how did people build an entire country where only the sea was meant to exist? To answer those questions, we have to turn back the clock. Looking at the Netherlands today, it's hard to believe that much of this country was once not land at all. Modern cities, endless farmland, and dense highways have almost completely erased the landscape that existed here thousands of years ago. Rewind thousands of years and the landscape looks completely different. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and today's fertile farmland were once endless marshes where Europe's greatest rivers met the North Sea, and the boundary between land and water shifted after almost every major storm. For thousands of years, rivers carried sand, mud, and sediment from across Europe into this delta, slowly building new land along the coast while leaving it low, soft, and constantly vulnerable to the tides. It was a remarkable paradox. The same water that created this land also kept it from ever becoming truly stable. For the first settlers, flooding was not an occasional disaster but a way of life. They adapted by building artificial mounds and raising their homes above the water, allowing entire villages to remain above the flood until the tide retreated. For centuries, that strategy was enough to survive, but survival was never the same as prosperity. As the population grew, settlements expanded, but dry land remained scarce, forcing every generation to confront the same question: should they abandon this land or change it? Most civilizations throughout history would have chosen the first option. The Dutch chose the second. They stayed not because the land was easy to live on, but because they believed that if nature would not provide enough land, they would create it themselves. That decision changed the course of Dutch history. From that moment on, their goal was no longer to adapt to water, but to take land from the sea. But how can humans take part of the ocean and turn it into dry land? The idea of taking land from the sea sounded almost impossible, because the ocean is not like a forest that can be cut down or a mountain that can be leveled. It is a massive body of water that constantly tries to fill every empty space humans create. The Dutch understood that if they wanted to turn part of the sea into land, they could not begin by building houses or planting crops. First, they had to build a massive dike capable of completely separating a section of water from the open sea, almost like constructing a gigantic wall around part of the ocean. When the final section of the dike was finally closed, everything inside was still nothing more than a vast body of water. That was also the moment they realized the hardest part of the project had only just begun, because the land they wanted was still buried deep beneath the water. To uncover that hidden land, the Dutch dug canals to collect the water into central drainage points, then used enormous windmills to power giant scoop wheels that continuously lifted the water over the dike and returned it to the sea for months, sometimes even years, until the water level dropped low enough for the seabed to slowly emerge. What appeared afterward must have been astonishing. Instead of seeing a brand new island rising from the ocean, they found themselves standing on the floor of a former sea, a place that had remained underwater for thousands of years, and had only now become dry land for the very first time. The Dutch called land reclaimed in this way a polder, and over the centuries, those polders gradually expanded the map of the entire country. At first, they were only small strips of land along the coast, but century after century, the polders grew larger and larger until the Dutch eventually created an entirely new province called Flevoland, where hundreds of thousands of people now live on land that once belonged to the sea. It was an achievement that very few nations in history have ever accomplished. But reclaiming land from the sea was only half the story. How have those lands, lying below sea level, remained dry for hundreds of years? If you ask what keeps the Netherlands from sinking, most people immediately think of the massive sea dikes stretching along the coastline. But that is only half of the answer. The dikes only stop seawater from entering from the outside. Water, however, has never come only from the sea. Every day, Europe's great rivers continue carrying water into the Netherlands. Rain keeps falling across the country, and eventually all of that water flows toward the lowest land. That means even if the sea never crosses the dikes, water will continue accumulating inside the country. If it is not constantly removed, the land reclaimed from the sea will gradually turn back into lakes once again. In the Netherlands, even a single drop of water has almost no freedom to decide where it will flow. From the moment it falls onto the ground, it is guided through canals, sent to pumping stations, and finally returned to rivers or the sea along routes carefully designed by humans. Seen from above, the entire system resembles a vast network of blood vessels covering the Netherlands, constantly collecting water from every direction and carrying it safely out of the country along carefully planned routes. For centuries, that job was carried out by the windmills that have since become the most famous symbol of the Netherlands. Their original purpose, however, was never to create picturesque scenery or attract tourists, but to power giant scoop wheels that continuously lifted water over the dikes. Many people still think Dutch windmills are simply cultural icons, but long before they became symbols, they were machines that helped save an entire country. Today, most of those windmills have been replaced by powerful electric pumping stations. Yet the principle has hardly changed, because the goal has always remained the same: continuously remove water from land that lies below sea level. That is why engineers often compare the Netherlands to a giant bathtub with its drain running day and night. If the pumping ever stopped for long enough, water would begin collecting in the lowest areas before gradually spreading across the surrounding land. The remarkable part is that this entire system does not operate only during storms. It works every single day, every hour, and almost every minute. After centuries of making the system work, the Dutch gradually came to believe they had finally mastered the water. But then, for the first time, the machine failed. On the night of January 31st, 1953, a powerful North Sea storm, combined with an exceptionally high tide, creating forces far beyond what many of the Dutch sea dikes of that time were designed to withstand. For hours, relentless waves pounded against the dikes, while the water level continued rising, until the first section finally collapsed, opening a path for the entire sea to surge straight into the land. Seawater no longer seeped in, little by little. It crashed into the lowlands with overwhelming force, quickly swallowing entire villages in the darkness, forcing thousands of families onto their rooftops to wait for rescue, while farmland that had taken centuries to reclaim from the sea became an inland sea again in a single night. When the storm finally passed, more than 1,800 people had lost their lives. Tens of thousands of homes had been destroyed or swept away, and a vast part of the southwestern Netherlands lay underwater once again, making it one of the country's worst natural disasters in modern history. But what made 1953 a true turning point was not only the scale of the disaster. It shattered the belief that simply building higher dikes would allow humanity to control the sea forever. After that night, the Dutch stopped thinking about building bigger dikes and began asking a much bigger question. If the dikes could never be trusted completely, Could humanity stop the ocean itself at the very mouth of the sea? The disaster of 1953 did not only wash away homes, farmland, and more than 1,800 lives, it also swept away a belief that had existed for centuries, that simply building higher dikes would always keep the Netherlands safe. The Dutch realized that if they continued repairing damaged dikes after every storm, they would always be chasing the ocean instead of staying ahead of it, and sooner or later, that was a battle they would lose. They needed a completely different approach. Instead of waiting for seawater to flood inland before trying to stop it, they began asking why not stop the ocean at the very place where it first enters the land. The idea sounded almost impossible. The goal was no longer to build another dike or dig another canal, but to place gigantic gates across the river mouths so the ocean itself could be closed whenever a storm approached. From that idea came the Delta Works, a vast system of dams, tidal sluices, sea dikes, and storm surge barriers built at the most critical points of the Dutch Delta, transforming many separate defenses into one unified network protecting the entire country. Seen from space, the Delta Works does not look like a construction project. Instead, it resembles a series of enormous locks placed precisely where the ocean can penetrate deepest into the land. Yet even the Delta Works was not the boldest engineering project the Dutch would build. To protect the port of Rotterdam, one of Europe's busiest seaports, the Dutch faced an even greater challenge, because they could not simply build a permanent dam and block the passage of tens of thousands of ships every year. Their answer was the Maesland Barrier. For most of the year, the two enormous steel gates of the Maesland Barrier rest beside the riverbanks, almost disappearing among the constant flow of ships. So few people realize they are passing one of the largest storm surge barriers ever built. But when the forecasting system determines that the sea level is about to exceed the danger threshold, the entire structure immediately comes to life. The two steel gates, each weighing thousands of tons, slowly rotate away from their resting positions, move steadily toward the center of the river, close together at a precisely calculated point. Only now does the opening line of this video reveal its true meaning. On certain nights, an entire country really does close its doors against the sea. Today, many engineers regard the Delta Works as one of the greatest achievements in modern hydraulic engineering, not because it tries to defeat every wave, but because it completely changed the way humanity confronts the ocean. Yet the greatest irony was that just as people believed they had locked the sea away, the greatest threat was no longer coming from the horizon, but was quietly emerging beneath their feet. The very land the Dutch had spent centuries reclaiming from the sea slowly began sinking, because once the water was drained away, the peat and soft soils that had been supported by water for thousands of years gradually dried, compressed, and settled lower over time. The process was so slow that almost no one could notice it over the course of a day or even a year. But after decades, those tiny changes accumulated into an entirely new reality. The frightening reality is that the Netherlands is not sinking overnight like it did during the disaster of 1953. Instead, it is sinking by millimeters every single year. It is a paradox the Dutch cannot escape. The more successful they become at draining water to create land, the more that reclaimed land tends to sink, ensuring that their battle with water never truly ends. As the land continues to sink, sea levels are quietly rising year after year, steadily narrowing the distance between the ocean and the Netherlands' lowest lying land, like two lines slowly moving toward each other. But even that is still not the whole story. As seawater pushes farther into river estuaries, salt water begins creeping into freshwater supplies and farmland, forcing the Dutch not only to keep their land dry but also to balance freshwater, salt water, and the ecosystems that support millions of lives. After centuries of building dikes, digging canals, and closing off the sea, the Dutch gradually realized that the challenge was no longer how to push water farther away, but how to live with it for the long term. If humanity can never defeat nature forever, could it learn to work with it instead? After centuries of building dikes, digging canals, and creating machines capable of closing off the sea itself, the Dutch ultimately reached a conclusion that seemed to contradict everything they had done before. If they wanted to survive in the long term, they could no longer treat water as an enemy to be defeated. They realized that the harder they tried to push water farther away, the larger, more expensive, and more complex the engineering projects became, as nature continued creating new challenges of its own. Instead of asking how to keep water out, the Dutch began asking a completely different question: how could they give water room to return without destroying human lives? That change transformed not only the way they built infrastructure, but also the entire philosophy of water management across the country. One of the clearest examples is the Room for the River program, where many dikes were moved farther inland, low-lying areas were restored, and floodplains were recreated, giving rivers more space to expand during floods instead of forcing them through increasingly narrow corridors until the system reached its limits. If the goal in the past was to force rivers to adapt to people, today the Dutch deliberately adapt their planning to the rivers instead. The same philosophy appears in the design of new neighborhoods, where more and more floating homes are built to rise and fall with changing water levels, instead of remaining fixed to the ground, turning nature's changing conditions into part of everyday life, rather than a threat to eliminate. Even coastal protection changed in the same direction. Instead of constantly building more sea defenses or repeatedly adding sand to eroding beaches, the Dutch created the sand motor, a giant artificial sand peninsula, then allowed the wind, waves, and ocean currents to gradually distribute the sand naturally along the coastline, doing the work that people once tried to do themselves. For the first time, nature was no longer simply something to control. It became part of the solution itself. That may also be the greatest transformation in the Netherlands' centuries-long journey. At first, they learned how to reclaim land from the sea. Then they learned how to keep that land dry. When that was no longer enough, they built machines capable of closing off the sea itself. But in the end, they realized that the greatest breakthrough was not controlling more water. It was learning to understand water better. Perhaps that is the real reason why a country with much of its land below sea level still exists today. Not because the Dutch are stronger than nature, nor because they built the world's most massive engineering projects, but because after centuries of living with water, they learned something that very few civilizations have ever accepted. Nature is not an enemy to defeat. It is a force that humanity must learn to live with. If you're curious about how our planet really works, subscribe to Hidden Earth for more stories about geography, science, and the extraordinary ways humans adapt to Earth.